Beneath the black hills of Appalachia, where fog drifts like a living thing and silence presses against the windows of forgotten houses, there is a story no family ever wanted to tell. It is the story of a bed, a father, and a bloodline so tangled it became its own prison. West Virginia's coal camps were built on hardship, but inside their wooden shacks, darker foundations were laid, marriages that never left the walls they were born in. This is not the tale of a stranger's sin. It is the marrow of kin upon kin, a father whose children called him not only daddy, but something far more forbidden. The men who dug coal for pennies believed their suffering was enough. They did not know that, only a few doors down, another kind of suffering was being born, quiet, secret, and sealed into flesh itself. In those mountains, where the land swallows sound and outsiders rarely stay, the truth did not travel. Fathers became grandfathers to their own daughters' children. Cousins became wives. Brothers became husbands. And at the center of one such coal camp, a single man ruled his family not with money or guns, but with silence, fear, and the unbreakable chains of blood. They called him a provider. His daughters called him something else, and the children who came after bore the mark that no preacher's blessing could erase. Think of the narrow beds lined with thin quilts, the creaking floors that betrayed every footstep. Imagine a family with no visitors, no outsiders, no witnesses, just blood, folded back into itself, until features blurred, minds dimmed, and shame grew so deep that it was buried beneath generations. To speak it aloud was to curse your own name, yet to keep it hidden was worse. Because the coal dust washed away each evening, but the other stain, the one left in the blood, never could. This is West Virginia's hidden marriage bed. This is the story of the most inbred, father of the coal camps, a man who turned his house into a tomb of repetition, where every birth was another confession, and every face looked a little too much like his own. You are about to hear what was not meant to be heard. Once you know it, you cannot unknow it, and once you see his story, you will understand why the hills of Appalachia are not haunted by ghosts, but by bloodlines that should never have been. The coal camps of West Virginia were more than just places to live. They were cages built of timber and poverty, where families lived and died under the watchful eyes of the company that owned their homes, their food, and even their souls. To outsiders, the camps looked like tight-knit communities, rows of small houses, children running barefoot, men coated in black dust as they returned from the mines. But what outsiders could never see was what went on when the lamps were turned low, when the silence of the night became thick enough to hide what no one dared speak. Behind closed doors, in the dim flicker of kerosene light, the very structure of family was being rewritten, one bed at a time. The man at the center of this story was born into that silence. He was a miner's son, his childhood etched with hunger, his nights filled with the coughing of men choking on coal dust. But unlike the others who dreamed of escape, he built his roots deeper into the mountain. He learned early that in the camps, the law rarely entered, and if it did, it looked the other way. Ministers preached virtue on Sundays, but they did not step into the homes during the week. What happened inside the walls stayed inside the walls, and that secrecy was the soil where something poisonous grew. He was not the first in his line to cross the forbidden boundary. His own parents shared a relation closer than any Bible would allow. By the time he reached manhood, his mind was already shaped by what was around him. Family was not divided into branches but folded back in upon itself. Cousins were sweethearts, sisters were confidants, daughters became possessions. And for him, the line between what was his by blood and what was his by right blurred until it disappeared entirely. Neighbors whispered, of course. They saw the children with the faraway eyes, the strange sloping features, the way sickness seemed to cling to that house more than others, but no one dared say it out loud, not when the coal company wanted silence, not when survival itself depended on staying in your lane and keeping your mouth shut. In the mines, a man's life could end in an instant. In the camps, a family's reputation could die just as quickly. And so the most terrible secret was allowed to grow unchecked, tucked into a home where daughters were raised not for marriage to strangers, but for marriage to their own blood. This was not just survival, it was ownership, dominance, and the creation of a legacy that should never have existed. And yet, within those shacks, it was treated as natural, as inevitable, as though the mountain itself demanded it. As years passed, his family tree did not grow. It folded in on itself like a snake devouring its own tail. Children were born into the same small rooms where their mothers had once been born, the same thin blankets, the same wooden cradle reused until the wood splintered. These were not ordinary births. They carried with them the weight of secrets and the punishment of blood, refusing to mix with anything beyond itself. The children carried the father's face again and again, copied and pasted with each generation until their features became distorted echoes of the same man. Some of the children could not speak until far beyond their years. Others never learned to read, never learned to tie their shoes. There were twisted bones, crossed eyes, teeth that never aligned, and minds that wandered in a fog that no teacher could clear. When they played outside, their movements were slow, awkward, marked by a heaviness that spoke of more than poverty. And yet, when the neighbors looked on, they said nothing, because everyone knew. They just pretended not to. The daughters suffered in silence, their voices small in a house where every word was swallowed before it reached the air. To them, there was no escape. To refuse him was unthinkable. To speak of it was worse. The mountain isolated them from the world, and he isolated them from themselves. Their lives were bound to him, not by choice, but by the unbreakable grip of dependence and fear. And when the children came, they were not seen as shame, but as proof of his control, proof that his blood was stronger than any law or scripture. He told himself he was keeping the family together, that no man from outside would ever harm his daughters, because no man from outside would ever be allowed near them. But what he called protection was only another form of imprisonment. He locked them into a cycle where every birth chained them, tighter to him, where every child carried not only his blood, but also his shadow. It was a shadow that grew darker with each passing year, until the entire family seemed marked, set apart from the rest of the camp, feared and pitied at the same time. And in those mountains, people began to say that his house was cursed. They did not use the word incest. They called it something else, softer, safer, but in their eyes the truth was clear. The curse had a name, and that name was his. By the time the coal industry began to collapse, when men left the mines for the promise of better wages in far-off cities, his house still stood as if time itself refused to move forward there. The rest of the camp shifted and changed. Families moved, children grew into soldiers or factory hands, but his bloodline remained trapped, cycling endlessly inside those rotting walls. The daughters bore daughters who bore more children of the same line, each new face looking eerily familiar, each voice carrying the same slow, thick accent of the hills, as if even language was being inbred. The neighbors could not ignore it forever. Whispers turned into questions, and questions into quiet warnings. Women told their sons to stay away from that house. Men told their daughters not to look too long at the children who came from it. And yet, nobody intervened. Because to step into another man's house in those mountains was to declare war, and no one wanted to risk the wrath of a man who carried not only his own sins, but the silence of an entire community on his shoulders. The state, too, pretended not to see. Social workers came on rare occasions, but they never stayed long. Their reports were vague, filled with phrases like unfit environment and developmental delays. The deeper truth was left unspoken, buried in paperwork that never left the county office. They knew, but knowing was not enough to break the cycle. The coal camps were seen as lost causes, pockets of poverty best left untouched, hidden away where the rest of America wouldn't have to look too closely. And so the curse deepened. His children's children grew up in the same shack, ate at the same table, and lay down in the same beds where the first sin had been committed decades earlier. There were no new names in the family Bible, only the same few repeated over and over again, as if the book itself was unwilling to let outsiders in. The strangest thing, perhaps, was the way the family accepted their condition. They did not see themselves as victims of horror. To them, this was life, ordinary and unremarkable, the only world they had ever known. When you are born into a prison, the chains do not feel like chains, they feel like home. And that was the true tragedy of his hidden marriage bed. It was not just one man's crime, but a legacy disguised as normalcy. But the mountains have a way of keeping secrets until they can no longer be hidden. As the 20th century wore on, the story of his bloodline began to slip through the cracks. Outsiders, journalists, researchers, curious wanderers came into the hills chasing whispers of families that looked different, sounded different, lived by rules unspoken. They found children with vacant stares, jaws that never quite fit, laughter that came out broken and eerie. They found girls too young with babies on their hips, boys who never learned to leave their porches, men who seemed half-grown though their faces were wrinkled with age. It was then that the legend of the Inbred coal camp family was born, not whispered only by neighbors, but spoken by strangers, captured in photographs, scribbled in notebooks. And once the outside world saw, they recoiled in horror. To them, it was proof of something monstrous, a glimpse into the backwardness they long accused Appalachia of harboring. They did not see the silence, the poverty, the isolation that allowed it to take root. They only saw the faces, the blood turned inward, the man at the center whose name they dared not print. For his descendants, this was another kind of prison. No matter where they went, their features betrayed them. They carried his mark not only in their bones, but in the eyes of anyone who looked too long. They became living reminders of a sin that had started long before they were born, a sin they never chose, yet could never escape. The family itself fractured under that gaze, some retreating further into isolation, others trying desperately to hide their origin, changing names, inventing stories of absent fathers and dead mothers. But blood is a stubborn thing. It carries itself forward, even when you try to bury it. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have spoken? Would you have run? Or would the silence of the mountains have swallowed you whole, the way it did them? Because this is where the true horror lies, not in the man himself, but in the generations forced to live in the aftermath of his choices. They bore the weight of his hunger, his dominance, his twisted sense of family, and while the mines eventually emptied, while the company stores shut their doors, his curse lingered in the veins of his children. It is still there, carried quietly, hidden in plain sight. By the 1980s, the story of the coal camp's hidden lineage began to attract the attention of anthropologists and geneticists. They were drawn by rumors of unusually high rates of congenital disorders, strange familial traits repeating across generations, and the whispered tales of a father who refused to let his blood leave the mountains. What they found was both fascinating and horrifying. A family whose genetic history had been compressed, folded and repeated until the very DNA seemed trapped in a loop. Faces bore uncanny similarities, bodies showed signs of inherited deformities, and mental development in many children lagged far behind what outsiders would consider normal. Yet the family insisted, as they always had, that this was simply life as it had always been. Visits from experts were brief, often interrupted by the father or his older children, who maintained a strict code. Outsiders were tolerated, but only to the extent that they left without seeing too much. The researchers took notes, photographs and measurements, documenting features that should have been anomalies, but were instead ordinary in this isolated household. Still, the father's presence was commanding, quiet, terrifying in its normalcy. He did not need to shout or threaten. The mountain itself and the complicity of his family ensured obedience, and in that house the air carried the weight of decades of secrets that could never be fully unraveled. The psychological toll on the children was immense. They were taught obedience, fear, and silence, learning early that any expression of discomfort would be punished, not necessarily with violence, but with isolation, judgment, or being reminded of the family's unique legacy. They internalized shame, and by the time many reached adulthood, they were already resigned to the patterns of life they had inherited. Some tried to escape, only to return, drawn back by familiarity, fear, or a sense of inevitability that the mountain had instilled in them. Others stayed, quietly perpetuating the same cycle with their own children, repeating history because it was the only life they had ever known. And yet, even in this darkness, fragments of hope flickered. A few members eventually left, carving new lives for themselves outside the shadow of the mountain, outside the crushing grip of that father's bloodline. But they carried the mark invisibly: memories, genetic inheritance, the haunting knowledge of what had been normalized in that house. No matter how far they ran, the story traveled with them, a shadow they could not shake. This is the truth of West Virginia's hidden marriage bed, a tale not of monsters in the traditional sense, but of humanity warped by isolation, poverty, and obsession. A story of a father whose dominion over his children created a living archive of inbreeding, fear, and silence, one that refuses to be buried, even decades later. The mountain seems indifferent to human suffering, yet it remembers. Even now, long after the father's death, the remnants of his family linger in the shadows of the coal camps. Some still live in the original house, its wooden walls warped with age, its floors creaking under weight that has nothing to do with furniture. Others have scattered, attempting to vanish into towns and cities beyond the Appalachians, carrying with them the legacy they never asked for. And though the faces have changed slightly with each generation, the blood, stubborn, unyielding, remains. It whispers in the eyes of children, in the crooked smiles, in the faint, unshakable resemblance to the man who started it all. Local historians occasionally revisit the story, piecing together scraps from county records, whispered confessions, and the occasional photograph. Each discovery paints a picture more disturbing than the last. Birth certificates show repeated surnames, obituaries hint at familial overlaps, and census records reveal that the same houses harbored multiple generations of interwoven relations. These documents are cold, clinical, yet beneath the ink lies a truth far warmer, far darker, the warmth of human flesh, twisted by fear, ignorance, and desire. It is the human cost of isolation compounded over decades, where mountains do not merely separate families from society, but nurture secrets until they become generations deep. And still, outsiders are drawn, morbidly fascinated, to the place where the father ruled. Anthropologists, journalists, and amateur historians tread lightly, aware that the story they chase is alive, still affecting real people. Interviews with surviving family members are sparse and cautious. Many refuse to speak, and those who do often collapse into silence, the shame and fear written plainly on their faces. They were taught that the world would never understand, that even speaking of it was dangerous, and they were right. The truth is so grotesque, so intimate, that it threatens to unravel not just reputations but lives. It is here, in this mixture of myth, memory, and reality, that West Virginia's hidden marriage bed achieves its darkest resonance. The father is gone, but his influence lingers, not as a haunting spirit, not as folklore told by candlelight, but as living proof of what isolation and absolute control can create. The mountain conceals, but it does not absolve. The bloodline persists, a quiet reminder that the most horrifying truths are not always the ones in books. They are the ones hidden behind closed doors, in places no one dares to look, carried in the flesh of those who survived.